I want you to understand something before I start. I am not a soldier. I never was. I was a field correspondent, a documenter technically, which is a fancy word for someone who watches terrible things happen and writes them down so other people don't have to be there. I have covered famines. I have covered plague outbreaks on 3 different colony worlds. I once spent 11 days embedded with a relief convoy crossing the dusklands of Meridian IV, where the sun doesn't set for 6 months, and the heat turns your thoughts to something thick and slow. I thought I understood suffering. I thought I had a feel for the outer boundary of what a living creature could witness and still carry home with them. I was wrong. What happened at Vareth Station, what happened during those 22 days on the human warfront, redefined the outer boundary entirely. Not just for me, for every species who fought there, for every diplomat who reviewed the footage afterward. For the Galactic Commission itself, which spent 4 months trying to find a framework to describe what they had witnessed, and eventually gave up and issued a single classified document that, as far as I know, has never been released to the public in full. I have seen pieces of it, enough to know they struggled with the same thing I struggle with now. How do you explain what humans are when you are at war with them? How do you explain what it feels like to watch them fight? I'm going to try. Not because I think I'll succeed entirely, but because something this real deserves to be spoken, even if the words fall short, even if I lose the shape of it somewhere in the middle. Sit with me for a while, I'll take you there. Section II Setup. Vareth Station was not supposed to be a war zone. That's the first thing you need to understand about the geography of this disaster. Vareth was a transit hub, a mid-corridor refueling platform built 40 years ago when the Galactic Compact was still expanding its trade lanes into the outer spiral. The station was enormous by most standards: 5 rotating rings, 17 docking pylons, a permanent population of about 60,000, composed mostly of Veth traders, Sulori maintenance crews, and a small but growing contingent of human commercial workers who had come aboard through the Compact's labor integration program. It sat in a quiet stretch of space between the Karathi Reach and the Delian Corridor, 2 of the most commercially traveled lanes in the Outer Rim. The nearest active conflict zone when I arrived was 40 light-years away. The war between the Galactic Sovereignty and the human-allied Frontier Coalition had been grinding along for 16 months at that point, but it was happening at a distance. It was happening in places with battle names and strategic importance: Red Line Crossing, the Orani Nebula, the Siege of Dusk Point. Vareth was not one of those places. Vareth was where cargo moved and people rested, and the lights in the commercial ring stayed on past the 3rd rotation cycle, and you could get something resembling good food if you knew which corridor to walk down. I had been there twice before on transit layovers. I knew the smell of it: recycled air with a faint undertone of coolant and something organic and warm, like a spice market inside a machine. I knew the sound of it, the layered hum of 6,000 conversations happening simultaneously in a dozen languages, the distant rhythm of loading equipment on the docking arms, the occasional announcement from station operations in that flat, calm voice that transit hubs always seem to use regardless of species or origin. I arrived on a routine assignment. The Galactic Commission had tasked me with documenting the human integration workers, a human interest piece, ironically, about how humans were adapting to life in a compact facility. Were they fitting in? What were the friction points? What could be learned? My press credentials were in order. My equipment: a compact documentary rig, 2 recording drones, a translation module updated 3 weeks prior, was cleared through customs. I had accommodations in the press annex on Ring 3. My first interview was scheduled for the following morning, with a human shift supervisor named Daniel who ran a crew of 18 on the cargo intake platforms. I settled into my quarters. I reviewed my notes. I ordered food from the corridor dispensary, and watched the stars through the small viewport above my bunk, moving slowly past as the ring rotated. I fell asleep thinking this would be a quiet assignment. I woke up to an alert sound I had never heard before on any transit station in any system I had ever visited. Not an alarm exactly, more like the station itself inhaling sharply. And then the lights went red. Section III, the world before. Let me back up a little, because context matters here, and I don't want you to miss what made the next 22 days so particular. The galactic sovereignty, the sovereignty, most people call it, or just the Sov when they want to be casual about a military body that controls roughly 40% of inhabited space, had been at war with the Frontier Coalition for 16 months. On paper, this was a border dispute, a disagreement about resource extraction rights in a cluster of newly mapped systems past the Delian Corridor. In practice, it was about something much older and more uncomfortable. It was about what happened when humans started showing up in large numbers in spaces that had not been designed for them. Humans had been in the Galactic Compact for 60 years. 60 years of careful, incremental integration, trade agreements, labor programs, cultural exchange, the slow grinding work of fitting a new species into systems built by and for species with very different histories and very different instincts. 60 years of the rest of the galaxy looking at humans and thinking, quietly, that they were manageable. Interesting, maybe. Industrious, certainly. But manageable. The war changed that calculation. Not because of any single battle. Not because of any particular weapon or strategy or act of leadership. But because of the cumulative weight of watching human soldiers fight. Watching them absorb losses that should have broken any rational military force, and then stand up again. Watching them operate in conditions that the sovereignty's own medical models had assessed as unsurvivable, and survive. Watching them make decisions in the middle of catastrophic engagement that did not follow any tactical logic, the sovereignty's commanders could decode decisions that looked like chaos, and then turned out to be something much more frightening than chaos. Purpose. The sovereignty's initial projections when the war began had given the coalition 6 weeks before collapse. They had reasonable data to support this. Human military technology was behind the curve. Human numbers, while growing, were still a fraction of the sovereignty's deployable forces. Human colony infrastructure was vulnerable at multiple strategic points. The math was clean and confident. The math was wrong. By month 4, the sovereignty's senior command had revised their projection twice. By month 8, they had stopped issuing projections. By month 12, there were rumors, just rumors, at the level I operated that the sovereignty's High Council had begun requesting classified briefings on human psychology, human neurochemistry, human cultural history going back to pre-contact. They were trying to understand something they had not thought they needed to understand. Why won't they stop? Vareth Station was about to give them a very thorough answer. Section IV, the night it started. The alert that woke me was called a proximity breach notification. I learned that term later. In the moment, all I knew was that the red light was replacing the soft amber of sleeping hour station illumination, and that the announcement system was speaking in a tone that the flat, calm transit voice did not usually use. Attention all station residents. An unscheduled fleet formation has been detected in Vareth approach space. All non-essential personnel are requested to move to interior sections. Docking operations are temporarily suspended. Station security is responding. This is not a scheduled drill. I was out of my bunk and into my gear before the announcement finished. This is a thing I will not apologize for. I am a correspondent. When something starts, I move toward it. It is not bravery. I have been accused of bravery and I always correct the record. It is compulsion. It is the same instinct that makes certain animals run to the edge of a cliff to see what is below. Probably not adaptive. Definitely not something I can turn off. I grabbed my rig, activated both drones, and moved into the corridor. Ring 3 was already transformed. The easy, crowded hum of the transit station had evaporated. In its place was something thinner and colder, the sound of people trying to move quickly without running, which creates its own specific texture of fear. Veth families moving with their children held close. Solari workers talking rapidly in clusters, their secondary skin patterning shifting through stress colors, pale blue to orange to a deep, anxious brown. Human workers moving too, but differently. I noticed the difference immediately, and I am going to be careful about how I describe it because I want to get it right. The non-human residents of Ring 3 were responding to the threat alert the way most rational beings respond to sudden danger in an enclosed space. They were looking for safety. They were calculating the distance to interior sections. They were clustering with known companions. They were afraid, visibly and comprehensibly afraid, in the way fear is supposed to work, a signal that tells you to protect yourself. The human workers were doing something different. They were talking to each other quickly and quietly, but they were not moving toward the interior. Several of them were moving in the opposite direction, toward the outer ring, toward the docking arms, toward the proximity breach. I followed them. I know, but I followed them. Section V, the DOCKING arm. The human shift supervisor I was supposed to interview the next morning, Daniel, was already at the observation post on docking arm 4 when I arrived. He was with 11 of his crew. They were standing at the reinforced viewport that looked out into approach space, and they were looking at what had come to Vareth. I looked too. I had seen sovereignty fleet formations in documentary footage before. I had studied them as part of my preparation for war coverage. I thought I understood their scale. Understanding something intellectually, and standing at a viewport watching it materialize in space in front of you are two entirely different experiences. The sovereignty force that had dropped out of transit fold into Vareth approach space was not a strike team. It was not a patrol formation. It was a mid-weight fleet deployment. 11 warships of the heavy cruiser class, 7 escort destroyers, and a command carrier that was so large it seemed for a moment that Vareth Station's windows had simply stopped showing stars in a particular direction and started showing hull. The command carrier was the GSSV Eternal Accord. I learned its name from the station's identification system, which was attempting, in that calm transit voice, to classify what it was seeing and broadcast the classification to all public terminals. The Eternal Accord was one of the Sovereignty's primary force projection platforms, a ship designed not just for combat but for the psychological dimensions of combat. It was built to be seen, built to communicate with its sheer physical mass the futility of resistance. It was working on most of the people around me. Not on Daniel. He was leaning against the viewport rail, looking at the Eternal Accord, and he was thinking. I could see it, not anxiety, not fear, the specific particular expression of a person who is solving a problem. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were moving, tracking something across the ship's visible surface. Daniel, one of his crew said quietly. Her name was Kessa, I learned that later. She was a cargo systems technician, 26 years old, from a settlement world called Brightedge near the Delian Corridor's outer terminus. Daniel, that's a sovereign carrier. I know what it is, he said, not unkindly, just flat present. What do we do? He didn't answer immediately. He kept looking. Then he said, we find out what they want first. Section VI, the demand. What they wanted came through station communications 40 minutes later, in a formal broadcast that occupied every public channel simultaneously. It was delivered in Compact Standard, the trade language that most species in the Galactic Compact share at a functional level. And it was carefully worded in the bureaucratic register that the Sovereignty always used when it was doing something it wanted to frame as administrative rather than military. The essence of it was this. Vareth Station, in its capacity as a compact facility with a significant human labor population, was to comply with the Emergency Alien Presence Protocol, a sovereignty directive, issued 3 months prior and contested by the coalition, that required any station or installation within a sovereignty-designated strategic corridor to register, document, and facilitate the immediate temporary relocation of all human nationals to designated holding facilities pending security review. In plain language, they wanted the humans off Vareth Station. The reasoning given was strategic. The Frontier Coalition had been moving supply lines through commercial space, using transit hubs, theoretically neutral, as logistics waypoints. The Sovereignty had intelligence, they said, suggesting Vareth was a node in this network. The human workers present were not being accused of anything. This was precautionary. This was administrative. This was fully within the Sovereignty's rights under emergency protocol. The station's governing council, a 7-member body representing the major resident populations, was given 4 hours to comply. I was sitting in the corridor outside the council chambers when the broadcast ended, my recording rig running, watching people absorb what they had just heard. The humans around me were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness, it's density. Too many things being thought at once to produce any single sound. Then Daniel, who was sitting on the floor next to me with his back against the wall and his forearms resting on his knees, said something I have carried with me since. "They never actually counted us," he said, not to me, mostly to himself. 60 years in this compact and they never actually counted us. He said it the way you say something you have suspected for a long time, and just had confirmed. Section VII First Night. The Governing Council asked for an extension. They got 2 hours. The Sovereignty was accommodating, in the specific way that a force of 18 warships can afford to be accommodating when it is orbiting something much smaller than itself. During those 2 hours, Vareth Station transformed. I am going to be honest. I had expected in the back of my documenter's mind that the transformation would be one of capitulation, that the logic of the situation, the math, again, the inescapable math of relative military force would assert itself, that the humans on Vareth, all 6,000 of them, would start the process of compliance, not happily, not willingly, but practically, because sometimes practical is the only option. What happened instead is the thing I am still trying to fully articulate. The humans on Vareth organized. Not through any single leadership structure, not through any pre-existing chain of command. They organized the way, I am going to use a metaphor that I borrowed from a human historian I interviewed much later, and it is the most accurate one I have found. They organized the way a body responds to infection. Distributed, parallel, many separate responses converging on the same goal without a central directing intelligence. Within 45 minutes of the broadcast, I had documented the following, entirely through my own observation on Ring 3. 7 separate human crew teams had begun coordinating with each other using private short-range communication channels, not the station network, which the Sovereignty might be monitoring, but encrypted personal comm units that the workers used for family calls. 3 of the maintenance workers in Daniel's crew, all of whom had technical access to the cargo intake systems, had quietly begun the process of sealing certain sections of the station's loading infrastructure in ways that would make rapid physical access to those areas extremely difficult without causing collateral damage to the station's structural systems. A human woman named Suri, a medical technician, one of the few with professional training, had converted the crew health annex on Ring 3 into an unofficial coordination point, and people were cycling through constantly, quietly, in small groups. And Daniel himself had walked across the corridor and knocked on the door of a Sulori family he apparently knew by name, and had spoken to the father of that family for 10 minutes, very quietly, and the Sulori man had listened, and then had nodded, and then had gone inside and closed his door but not locked it. I did not understand that last detail at the time. I understand it now. He was telling them, "Come here if you need to." Section VIII. What the council decided. The governing council did not comply. This surprised almost everyone, including, I think, some of the council members themselves. They were not a courageous body by nature or design. They were a transit station administrative board, most of them appointed by commercial interests, most of them more comfortable resolving cargo disputes than confronting fleet carriers. But something in the calculus of that night shifted them. I think it was the humans. Specifically, I think it was the way the humans had responded. The council chambers had monitors connected to the station's internal cameras, and the council could see Ring 3. They could see what was happening. They could see 6,000 people deciding, collectively and without instruction, that they were not going to go quietly to holding facilities. And I think something about that, something about the sight of it, changed the calculation for people who had been weighing risk against risk. The official response to the sovereignty was issued at the end of the extended window. Vareth Station did not recognize the Emergency Alien Presence Protocol as applicable to its jurisdiction. The station was a compact facility, not a sovereignty installation. The humans present were legally resident workers with valid documentation. The governing council requested that the fleet formation stand down and that any concerns about coalition supply activity be raised through the established diplomatic channels of the Galactic Compact. It was, given the circumstances, a very politely worded refusal to do what 18 warships were asking. The sovereignty's response came 40 minutes later. They didn't broadcast this one. They sent a tight beam signal directly to the station's command center. I got the text of it later from someone on the council staff who was brave enough, or angry enough, to share it. It said compliance is expected. The alternative is intervention. It did not specify what intervention meant. It didn't need to. Section IX. Build tension. The first 3 days were not violent. That might sound like a relief. In some ways it was. But there is a particular kind of tension that comes from a period of not yet, from standing on a station with 18 warships outside, and knowing that the next thing that happens will be either a miracle or a catastrophe, and not knowing which, and not being able to do anything about it except breathe and wait. The Sovereignty moved 2 of its destroyers into close orbital positions around the station, close enough that you could see them clearly from the outer ring viewports, close enough to be a message. They began broadcasting, on loop, a formal accounting of the emergency protocol and the benefits of compliant processing, medical assessment, temporary comfortable accommodation, a defined timeline for review. The broadcasts were calm. They were polite. They were the voice of an institution that had decided it was going to be reasonable about this, right up until the moment it wasn't. The humans ignored the broadcasts. That's not quite right. They listened. Several of them recorded every iteration for analysis. Kessa, the cargo technician, had set up a system to track any variations in the broadcast language, any shift in tone or word choice that might indicate a change in sovereignty patience. She was looking for signals. What she found on day 3 was a signal none of us had expected. The broadcast stopped. Not the loop, the broadcasts entirely. All sovereignty communication to Vareth Station went silent. Their ships maintained position. Their formation didn't change. But the voice, the calm, polite, institutional voice that had been cycling through the station speakers every 40 minutes, simply stopped. Suri, in the coordination annex, looked at the silence data on her terminal for a long time. "That's not de-escalation," she said. "No," Danil agreed. "That's them deciding something." "Yes." I was in the corner of the annex with my recording rig running. I was trying to be as small and unobtrusive as possible, because I have learned that the best documentation happens when people forget you are there. I watched Surrey and Daniel look at each other across a room that was full of people who were pretending not to listen, and I watched them communicate something complex in a very short silence, and then I watched both of them straighten slightly, as if they had made a decision. "What's the status on the cargo arm seals?" Daniel asked the room. "Holding," someone said, "but they'll notice if they do a detailed scan." "Can we do anything about that?" "Not without triggering the scan ourselves." A pause. "Okay. What about the maintenance shafts?" Section X. What was happening in the maintenance shafts? I am going to be honest with you about what I saw in the maintenance shafts of Vareth Station, because it was one of the moments that rewrote something in my understanding of what humans are. The maintenance shafts of a transit station are not pleasant. They are not designed for extended human or any species habitation. They are narrow, poorly lit, temperature-variable corridors that run through the structural skeleton of the station's rings, used primarily by service robots and occasionally by maintenance workers who need physical access to systems that can't be reached any other way. The longest of them on Ring 3 ran for nearly 400 meters without a comfortable turning point. The ceiling clearance in most sections was low enough that a human had to hunch. By day 4, 47 people were living in the maintenance shafts. Not because they had been forced there, by choice. They had organized it themselves, rotations, so no one was in there all the time. Supply runs through sections of the station the sovereignty's scanning likely couldn't penetrate, sleeping arrangements that were, by any objective standard, miserable. What they were doing in there, while they lived in those conditions, was modifying Vareth Station. I have to be careful about the specifics here, not for any dramatic reason, but because some of what I saw involved technical knowledge I don't fully possess, and I don't want to misrepresent it. What I can tell you is the broad shape. They were adapting the station's systems, not breaking them, not sabotaging them, adapting them, rerouting power flows through secondary conduits, adjusting the station's structural field emitters in ways that would make certain types of remote boarding maneuvers significantly more difficult, creating redundant communication, pathways through the station's own hardware that didn't use any channel the sovereignty could easily jam. They were doing this in shifts, in the dark, in 47-degree corridor sections that smelled of metal and old lubricant, with hand tools and improvised equipment, and the kind of focused, sustained, collaborative concentration that I had not previously associated with the human workers I had been hired to document. One of the workers in the maintenance shafts was a 19-year-old named Rio. He was not an engineer. He was a cargo loader, physically strong, technically trained for equipment operation, not system architecture. But he had grown up on Brightage too, a settlement world, which meant he had grown up fixing things that no one had designed spare parts for, in conditions that rewarded creative solutions over correct ones. I found him on my second visit to the shafts, wedged into a space barely big enough to contain him, rewiring something in a secondary power junction, with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what they were doing even if they couldn't formally explain why. I asked him quietly, because sound carried strangely in those corridors, what he was working on. He looked at me for a moment, deciding how much to tell a correspondent. "Making it so they can't just walk in," he said finally. "How?" He considered. "You know how the station's docking force fields work." I said I had a general understanding. "They're designed to be easily overridden from outside," he said. "Safety reasons. If a ship is in distress, you don't want the station locking them out. But that also means anyone with the right codes can lower them from a distance." He looked at the junction. "We're adding some steps." "Steps?" "More steps than they're going to want to deal with." He went back to his work. I left him there and went back to Ring 3 with my documentation, and I sat in the corridor for a while, and thought about what it meant that a 19-year-old cargo loader from a settlement world was, at this moment, one of several dozen humans who were quietly and methodically turning a transit station into something that would be considerably harder to take by force than it had been 72 hours ago. I thought about the sovereignty's projections, about their math, about the word manageable. I thought about how catastrophically they had misunderstood what they were dealing with. Part 2. The Warfront comes to VARTH. Section XI Day 6. The Coalition found out about Vareth on Day 6. I don't know exactly how. The communication pathways the humans on the station had established were deliberately opaque, and even with my documentation access, I wasn't cleared for all of their internal channels. But on the morning of Day 6, Daniel came into the coordination annex with a different expression than he had worn any of the previous 5 days. It was still controlled. He was always controlled. But underneath the control there was something that I can only describe as relief mixed with grief, which is a combination that doesn't make immediate sense until you understand what the message had contained. The Coalition knew where they were. The Coalition was moving assets, but the nearest available Coalition force was 6 days away at maximum transit speed. 6 more days. The relief was obvious. Help was coming. The grief was in the arithmetic. 6 more days of the sovereignty sitting outside their station deciding. 6 more days of the kind of tension that grinds people down in ways that combat, paradoxically, sometimes doesn't, because at least in combat you are doing something, you are in motion, your fear has a direction. 6 more days of waiting. I watched Daniel brief his team. He was honest with them. He told them the timeline. He told them that they were on their own until that window closed. He told them that the sovereignty would almost certainly make its move before then. Then he said something I am going to remember for the rest of my life. 6 days is enough, he said. 6 days has always been enough. Every single time in human history that someone has told us we just have to hold for 6 more days, or 60 more days, or 600 more days, we have held. We have not always held elegantly. We have not always held without cost, but we have held. He looked around the room. So that's what we're going to do. Section XII, the SULORI factor. This is the part that I think history will underestimate, and I am going to give it the space it deserves. On Day 7, the Sulori maintenance crews on Vareth Station made a decision. The Sulori are a species I knew before Vareth only in the most general terms. Hive-adjacent social structure, remarkable collective problem-solving capability. Not aggressive, the Sulori had never historically been a militaristic species. They were builders and maintainers, the people who kept the infrastructure of the compact running, which made them present on virtually every major station and installation in inhabited space. On Vareth, there were approximately 8,000 Sulori residents, the largest non-human population on the station. They had been watching the situation develop from behind closed doors, complying with the sovereignty's general instruction to remain calm and out of the way, because the sovereignty's directive was technically only about human residents, and the Sulori had no formal stake in the dispute. On Day 7, a Sulori crew supervisor named Velith, and I want to get this name into the record because it deserves to be there, went to find Daniel. They met in the cargo bay access corridor on Ring 2. I was following Daniel at that point, which is how I witnessed it. The conversation was brief. Velith said, "We see what you are doing in the maintenance shafts, in the cargo arms." Daniel waited. "We know these systems better than you do," Velith said. "We have been maintaining them for 11 years. Another pause. "If you show us what you need," Velith said, "we can do it faster, and we know which sections the sovereignty scans cannot reach, because we are the ones who set up the scan architecture when the station was built." Daniel looked at this Sulori crew supervisor for a long moment. Then he put out his hand, palm up, which I had come to understand was a human gesture of offering, not a request, and Velith placed their own hand in his, and they held that contact for a moment. "Thank you," Danel said. "We have children on the station," Velith said simply. "If they take you, what comes next?" What comes next? It is a question that reveals a certain understanding, that the logic of the sovereignty's directive, if accepted, does not stop where it currently stands, that the humans being removed today is a precedent, and precedents are the way institutions move without appearing to move, that Velith and the Sulori crews had been watching and calculating, and had reached their own conclusion about what the math actually required. From day 7 onward, the Sulori were fully integrated into the station's resistance infrastructure, and the modifications that had been taking 40 hours to complete were being completed in 11. Section XII. The Sovereignty moves. On the morning of day 9, the Eternal Accord repositioned. It moved from its orbital station to a direct approach vector, not a docking approach, which would have required coordination and consent, but a pressure approach. A message in trajectory. The command carrier settled at a distance of approximately 12 kilometers from Varith's outer ring, which put it close enough that the sheer physical fact of it was inescapable from any viewport on the station's exterior sections. At 12 kilometers, you can see the detail on a ship that large. You can see the gun batteries. You can count them. You can watch the loading indicators as they cycle from standby to ready. At 900 station time, the Sovereignty broadcast resumed. This time there was no recorded announcement. This time it was a live feed, a Sovereignty Fleet Admiral speaking from what appeared to be the command carrier's bridge, in full dress regalia, calm as water. The Admiral's name was Thesavik. I had seen his profile in press archives, career military, 20 years in Sovereignty Fleet Command, 3 combat deployments, known for a philosophy of what the Sovereignty called proportionate resolution, which meant overwhelming force applied precisely with minimal collateral. He said that the deadline had passed. He said that the Governing Council's noncompliance was noted and formally registered. He said that, in light of the station's refusal to facilitate orderly processing, the Sovereignty was authorized to conduct a direct intervention, a physical boarding operation carried out by Sovereignty ground forces to achieve the relocation that the station's council had refused to arrange voluntarily. He said the intervention would begin in 3 hours. He said that resistance would be classified as active hostility and would be responded to accordingly. He said he hoped the station's residents would make the sensible choice. The broadcast ended. The coordination annex on Ring 3 went very quiet. Danel was staring at the terminal where the feed had played. His expression had passed through several things in quick succession and settled on something I can only describe as absolute focus. The kind of focus that isn't about this moment, it's about the next 40 moments, already mapped, already in sequence. 3 hours, Kessa said. 2.5, Danel said. He said 3 because he wants us counting from the end of the broadcast. They'll move at the 2.5 mark. They always do. The room processed this. Someone asked how he knew. Because I would, he said simply. He started moving. Section XIV. Build tension. The 2 hours. What happened in the next 2 hours on Varith Station is the thing that I have tried hardest to document accurately, because it is the part that most requires a witness, the part that, described from the outside, sounds like one thing, but lived from the inside was something else entirely. There was no panic. That is the first thing I need to say. I want to say it clearly because it is the fact that most defies expectation. 6,000 people received confirmation that a Sovereignty boarding force was coming in 3 hours, and the response on Ring 3 was not panic. It was not collapse. It was not the moment the math finally won. It was organized, rapid, purposeful movement. Every human worker on Ring 3 had a job. Not because anyone had assigned them jobs in some master plan. Daniel and the coordination team were good, but they were not that good, not with 6,000 people in 3 hours. But because the networks that had been built over 9 days, the encrypted comms, the crew-to-crew relationships, the 11 days of low-grade collective problem-solving that had already happened meant that everyone knew their piece, knew their corridor section, their system access, their team. The Solari moved into the maintenance infrastructure with a speed and efficiency that made the humans look, by comparison, slightly fumbling. Velith's crews were everywhere, flowing through sections of the station that the Sovereignty's advanced scanners wouldn't be able to read clearly, making adjustments and reinforcements in the same rapid, collective way that they built and fixed everything. The non-combatants, the children, the elderly, the medically vulnerable, were moved to the interior sections of Ring 2 and 3, the deepest point of the station's civilian infrastructure, as far from the docking arms as it was possible to get. The Solari families moved together without prompting. The Veth traders, who had been trying very hard to remain neutral for 9 days, quietly joined them in the interior sections, and several Veth adults who had military histories. There are always more than you'd expect, appeared in the coordination annex, and said something brief to Daniel, and then went to whatever position he pointed them toward. Suri converted the crew health annex into a full medical station. Rio went back into the maintenance shafts. Kessa sat down at her monitoring terminal and did not leave it. And Daniel walked the exterior corridors of Ring 3 for 40 minutes, checking in with every team, every position, not giving speeches, not rallying. Just moving through the station the way you move through a place you are responsible for checking, confirming, being present. When he passed someone who looked scared, which was everyone, he acknowledged it directly. He didn't say, "Don't be scared," or "It'll be fine." He said, in most cases, something close to, "I know, stay with your team." Stay with your team. In the context of what was about to happen, it was the exact right thing to say, not reassurance, orientation, a direction. At the 2-hour mark, the Sovereignty's escort destroyers repositioned to cover the docking pylons. At the 2.5-hour mark exactly, the first Sovereignty boarding shuttle detached from the Eternal Accord's ventral bay. It was followed by 11 more. Section XV Climax, Contact. The first contact happened not at the docking arms, where the Sovereignty had directed their boarding force, but in Corridor 7 of Ring 3, which was a service access passage that the Sovereignty's advanced intelligence apparently had not prioritized. I was in Corridor 7. I want to be very precise about what I saw, because this moment has been described in other accounts, and several of those accounts are wrong in ways that matter. The Sovereignty ground forces were Keth Solari, a soldier caste species with significant physical advantages over most compact species, stronger, faster reflexes, trained from early development for exactly this kind of close-quarters boarding work. They came in through an emergency access point that Rio's modifications had not covered, a gap in the network that, in fairness, would have required knowledge of an obscure secondary specification document that even most maintenance workers didn't have access to. 6 of them came through that point, in full combat configuration. Their armor was matte black with the Sovereignty's insignia on the shoulder panels, and they moved with the efficiency of a unit that had done this particular type of operation many times. They turned the corner into Corridor 7, and found 32 human workers waiting. Not armed with anything significant, the humans on Vareth had no military weapons. This was a commercial transit station. What they had was cargo handling equipment, much of which is extremely heavy and extremely solid, tool kits, which contain items that can be held in specific ways, and a structural awareness of the corridor that the Sovereignty troops didn't have. And they had Daniel. He was at the front. He was not in any kind of combat stance. He was just standing there, in the middle of the corridor, with his arms at his sides, looking at the Kethsolari boarding troops the way he had looked at the Eternal Accord through the viewport on the first night, like a person solving a problem. The lead Kethsolari soldier. I will not pretend I can read Kethsolari facial expression, but I could read body language, and the body language said this is not what we were briefed for, raised a compliance directive device. Standard issue. It broadcasts a signal that triggers the compliance response in most compact species neurochemistry. Daniel didn't move. The soldier broadcast the signal. Daniel still didn't move. The Kethsolari troops looked at each other. This was, I believe, the first indication of a problem that would become much larger. The compliance directive device, which worked on a neurochemical basis, was calibrated for compact species. Humans, as I understand it, share some neurochemical architecture with other biological species. Enough to be legally compact member, enough to integrate into shared environments. But in specific stress conditions, human neurochemistry does something that no compliance device made for general compact species can fully override. It goes somewhere else. It does not comply. It does not calm. Under acute threat in a confined space protecting a group of people, it does something older and much less convenient for the people pointing the device. I don't have a better word for it than decides. Daniel took 2 steps forward. The lead Kethsolari soldier raised their weapon. Daniel kept walking. What happened next happened quickly, and I am going to be honest that my documentation coverage was imperfect during this section, because several of my recording drones were physically in the way of sight lines, and I was personally attempting to remain against the wall, in a position that minimized my likelihood of being part of the story rather than recording it. What I can tell you is this. 32 human workers engaged 6 Kethsolari boarding troops in Corridor 7 of Ring 3. The Kethsolari were better equipped, better trained, and individually physically superior in most measurable parameters. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, the 6 Kethsolari soldiers were secured, not dead, secured, which I think is important, and the corridor was intact, and every one of the 32 humans was still standing, several of them significantly injured but not one of them down. I have spoken since to sovereignty military analysts who reviewed the engagement footage I did capture. Their consistent response, when I describe those 4 minutes, is a long silence followed by questions that all circle around the same core of incomprehension. Why didn't they retreat? What was the tactical logic of the engagement approach? At what point did they make the calculation that they could win? The answer, and this is what I think the sovereignty has never fully accepted, is that the tactical logic isn't always the logic. That there are moments where the human decision isn't made in the calculating part of the brain at all. That when 32 people are defending a corridor that leads to the section of a space station where the children are, the question of whether they can win is not always the question that gets asked. The question that gets asked is, will we hold? And the answer, in Corridor 7 of Ring 3, as in so many other places I documented in those 22 days, was yes. Section XVI, the full engagement. The Sovereignty's 12 boarding shuttles made contact at 7 separate points around Varith Station over the next 6 hours. I cannot give you a complete account of all 7 engagements. I was physically present for 2 and received detailed first-hand reports for 3 more. For the remaining 2, I have secondary documentation, visual data from the station's systems, after-action accounts from survivors on both sides. What I can give you is the shape of it. The Sovereignty's boarding force, approximately 400 Kethsolari ground troops, plus support and command elements, was the largest internal security force I had seen deployed against a non-military target in my career. They were used to quick compliance operations. They were used to the compliance device working. They were used to their physical advantage, translating directly and immediately into control of a situation. Vareth Station gave them none of that. The modifications in the maintenance shafts and cargo arms slowed their movement through the station's infrastructure by a factor that I later heard a sovereignty analyst describe, with remarkable candor, as humiliating. The Sulari crews, who knew every junction and bypass in the station's skeleton, made themselves systematically invisible and consistently redirected sovereignty forces toward exactly the wrong corridors, not through confrontation, but through the quiet expertise of people who had built and maintained this structure for 11 years. A sealed door here, an environmental system malfunction there, a gravity gradient adjustment in a corridor that made movement in full combat armor suddenly, mysteriously difficult. And the humans fought. I am going to say that simply because it is the simple truth. The humans on Vareth Station, cargo workers, medical technicians, maintenance specialists, system operators, none of whom had military training, none of whom had signed up for anything except a labor program on a commercial transit hub, fought for 6 hours against a professional military force with superior equipment, superior individual capability, and the backing of 18 warships. They fought in corridors. They fought in access shafts. They fought at environmental control junctions and cargo arm interfaces, and the 2 points where sovereignty forces managed to breach the outer sections of Ring 2. They fought in the specific, practical, improvised way that people fight when they have no military training but significant technical knowledge of their environment, and an absolute clarity about why they are fighting. At the breach point on Ring 2, the moment I am most grateful I was present to document, sovereignty forces had pushed through to within approximately 80 meters of the interior section, where the non-combatants were sheltered. A team of 14 humans was holding the junction. They were holding it with cargo crating used as barricades, with system access tools, with 2 construction-grade plasma cutters that had been modified in ways I don't think the original manufacturers intended. At the 80-meter mark, the sovereignty force paused, regrouped. You could hear them through the corridor, the sound of their equipment, the rapid clicks of their communication system. Then silence. Then Daniel's voice, from somewhere behind me in the junction. They're waiting for authorization to use heavy ordnance. Kessa somewhere to my left. How long do they need? 6-7 minutes. Command has to approve it from the carrier. 6 minutes, Kessa repeated. She said it the same way she said everything, flat, precise, as if she were reading a system diagnostic. Then she stood up from behind the cargo crating, and she walked to the communication panel on the junction wall, and she did something to it that I could not fully see from my position. The Sovereignty's communication system, the tight beam network they were using to coordinate their boarding forces, went out. Not jammed, not disrupted, actually turned off from inside using a Sovereignty standard communication architecture backdoor that had been documented in a maintenance record 11 years ago when the station's systems were installed. A backdoor that no one should have known about, and that Velith's maintenance crews absolutely did know about, and had quietly included in the technical briefing they gave to Kessa 3 days earlier. The Sovereignty forces at the Ring 2 breach point were suddenly unable to contact their command carrier for authorization. They held position for 3 minutes, professional, disciplined, exactly as trained. Then their unit commander made the call to withdraw to the last secured position and re-establish communication. They never got back to Ring 2. Section XVI Resolution, Hour 18. At Hour 18 of the boarding operation, the Sovereignty forces were still on the station, but they had not achieved their objective. They held several docking arm sections and 3 exterior corridor junctions. They had not reached the interior human population. They had not conducted a single successful relocation. The Human Allied Coalition fleet arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule. There has been significant debate since about whether this was planned, whether the coalition had a faster route, or had anticipated the timeline more accurately, or had made a political decision to push their transit speed beyond rated parameters. I don't know the answer. What I know is what I saw through the viewport on Ring 3 when the Coalition force dropped out of transit fold into Vareth approach space. 14 ships. Smaller than the Sovereignty fleet for the most part. This was not a battle fleet, this was a rapid response force. But they were there, and they were in formation, and their weapons systems were hot. The standoff that followed lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of the two fleets facing each other across the volume of space around Vareth Station, with the boarding force still inside the station, and the Coalition ships positioned at the evacuation vectors, and the Sovereignty's eternal accord, making the extremely careful calculations of a command that had begun this operation as a quick administrative action, and found itself in something considerably more complicated. I spent most of those 9 hours in the coordination annex, with my recording rig running and my drones doing slow, careful passes through the sections I could access. I watched people who had been awake for 18+ hours, holding positions and checking systems, and passing food between stations, and doing all the small logistical work of sustained endurance that no one photographs, but that is actually the substance of how humans hold things. Rio came out of the maintenance shafts at hour 20. He sat down in the corridor outside the annex and ate something from a ration pack, and didn't say anything for a long time. His hands were shaking, not fear, the particular tremor of sustained physical exertion finally reaching its limit. He noticed me looking and held up the shaking hands and looked at them with the expression of someone inspecting a piece of equipment. "Still working," he said. He went back in at hour 21. At hour 27 of the total crisis, 18 hours of active boarding operation plus 9 hours of fleet standoff, the Sovereignty ordered its ground forces to withdraw. Not to surrender, not to admit failure. You will not find that word in any official Sovereignty communication from Vareth. They characterized it as a tactical pause pending diplomatic review. They characterized it as a decision made in the interest of minimizing harm to station residents. They characterized it in the careful bureaucratic language of an institution that is very practiced at describing retreat in ways that do not use the word retreat. The Keth Solari boarding forces withdrew through the docking arms and returned to their shuttles, and the shuttles returned to the Eternal Accord, and the Eternal Accord, over the following 4 hours, moved back to a non-pressure orbital distance. The Sovereignty fleet maintained position for another 6 days. Then, under a diplomatic framework negotiated between the Galactic Compact's Mediation Council and the Coalition, they withdrew entirely. Vareth Station remained in Compact jurisdiction. The humans remained on Vareth Station. Section XVI Aftermath. The day after the Sovereignty withdrawal, I walked Ring 3 for 4 hours with my recording rig running. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I think I was looking for what was left, what the face of a place looks like after something like this passes through it, what people are on the other side. The corridor sections near the breach points showed the evidence of the previous 22 days, marks on the walls, cargo crating in positions it wasn't meant to occupy, improvised reinforcements at corridor junctions, some of them quite elegant engineering-wise, some of them clearly the work of very tired people making very fast decisions. The smell of the station had changed. The warm, spiced machinery smell of transit commerce was underneath something else now, something more biological and more human, the smell of a place that has been lived in intensely. The Solari maintenance crews were already working. They had been working for, by my estimate, approximately 40 minutes after the Sovereignty forces cleared the last docking arm, moving through the station with the same efficiency and collective intelligence they always moved with, assessing, repairing, restoring. Velith was directing from a central position on Ring 2, surrounded by a cluster of crew team leads, reading damage reports and organizing response with the focused calm of someone doing exactly what they were trained for. They nodded at me when I passed. That is all. It felt like the right amount. I found Daniel in the cargo bay access corridor where he had first spoken to Velith. He was sitting on a cargo crate, not doing anything, just sitting. He looked like a person who had run a very long way and had stopped. I sat next to him. We didn't say anything for a while. Eventually, I asked him what he had thought that first night, when he saw the Eternal Accord through the viewport. He thought about it for a moment. Not about what to say. I think he was actually thinking about the question, actually going back to that night and finding the honest answer. I thought, he said, that it was the largest thing I had ever seen. He paused. And then I thought so. He wasn't being cavalier about it. It wasn't bravado. It was something more interesting than bravado. It was the genuine report of someone who had looked at an overwhelming thing and felt the appropriate awe of it, and then moved past the awe to the next question, the practical one, the only one that actually matters. What do we do now? Section XIX, What I Learned. I have been asked many times in the months since Vareth to characterize what I witnessed, to provide an analysis, to offer, as a professional observer of difficult things, some framework for understanding what happened. I find it harder to do than almost anything else I have documented, not because the facts are unclear. The facts in their basic sequence are very clear, but because the interpretive question, what does it mean, keeps resisting the frameworks I reach for. Here is what I have, after months of trying. The sovereignty misidentified the nature of what they were dealing with. This is obvious and has been noted by many analysts, but the specific nature of the misidentification is worth being precise about. They misidentified stubbornness as stupidity. They saw humans not complying with an overwhelming force and concluded that the noncompliance was irrational, that it would, when pressure increased, eventually give way to the rational response, which was to yield. What they did not understand, what I am not sure the Galactic Compact in general has ever fully understood, is that human noncompliance is not a failure of rationality. It is a different kind of rationality, one that does not weight overwhelming force as the dominant variable in the way that most compact species decision-making does. I think it comes from history. Human history is, by the account of any species that studies it, extraordinarily full of moments when humans should not have survived and did. When the math was demonstrably against them and they fought anyway. When the rational response to an overwhelming threat was capitulation and they chose something else. That history is not just story, it is, I believe, embedded in the way humans approach moments of crisis. Not always consciously, not always articulately. But when Daniel stood in Corridor 7 without flinching at a compliance device, and when Rio went back into the maintenance shafts at hour 21 with shaking hands, and when Kessa walked to the communication panel and made the Sovereignty's command authorization system go quiet, none of them were operating on a different calculation. They were operating on a different faith. The faith that the outcome of holding is not determined only by the objective advantage of the opposing force. The faith that holding itself changes things. I am not human. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I came to Vareth as an observer from a species that has not experienced the kind of historical pressure that shaped this particular faith. I do not have it myself. I cannot replicate it. But I watch it operate across 22 days and 40 meters of corridor and 6 hours of boarding engagement and 9 hours of fleet standoff, and I can tell you from the outside what it looks like. It looks like Daniel sitting on a cargo crate the morning after and saying so. It looks like Rio shaking hands going back into the dark. It looks like Velith, and this is the part I think is most important, standing next to Daniel in that corridor on day 7 and saying if they take you, what comes next? Because the Sulori saw it too. They saw what the humans were, and they made a calculation that the sovereignty's analysts had not made, and that the sovereignty's compliance devices had not accounted for. They made a calculation about what kind of thing is worth standing next to. Section XX ending. I left Vareth Station 11 days after the sovereignty fleet withdrew. The press annex was repaired by then. The damage from a boarding force breach that had passed within 20 meters of it was mostly cosmetic by that point, sealed and patched and smelling of fresh sealant in that slightly too clean way that repaired sections of transit stations always have. My accommodations were functional. The corridor dispensary was back online. On my last morning, I went to the observation post on Docking Arm 4, the same viewport where Daniel and his crew had stood on the first night, and looked at the eternal accord materializing out of transit fold. The approach space outside was clear. The stars moved past at the ring's rotation rate, steady and indifferent in the way that stars always are, because stars don't know what happens in the space between them and they don't particularly care. I stood there for a while. I thought about the word manageable, about all the years and all the species who had applied it to the humans in the Galactic Compact and thought it was accurate, who had looked at the math and felt confident. I thought about Daniel's answer to the eternal accord. So, I thought about a 19-year-old with shaking hands going back into the dark. I thought about the Governing Council, a group of administrators and commercial appointees who had not signed up for any of this, who had to look at a demand backed by 18 warships and find, somehow, inside themselves, the mechanism for the word no. I thought about what it costs to be that kind of species, the specific weight of a history that teaches you to hold. The price of all the times in all the centuries when holding was the only option and they held anyway, and the cost was enormous and they held anyway. It is not comfortable, I think, to be human. It is not simple. The faith that holding changes things is not a faith that protects you from loss. Vareth had losses. Not casualties in the combat operations, fortunately, but injuries that were serious, and 22 days of damage to people's sense of safety, and the particular damage of having been looked at by a sovereignty fleet and told that you are a problem to be processed. That damage is real. It doesn't go away just because you held. But I watched those people stand up anyway, and I watched them organize in the dark, and I watched a cargo loader from a settlement world rewire a space station's defensive systems with shaking hands and go back for more, and I watched a maintenance crew supervisor from a species that had no stake in the fight make a decision about what kind of thing is worth standing next to. And I thought, the math doesn't have a term for this. Whatever this is, the sovereignty's projections don't have a term for it. Whatever it is, that makes a species look at an overwhelming force and ask so. It doesn't fit in a strategic model. It doesn't appear in a logistics calculation. It doesn't show up in an advanced intelligence report about a transit station's human labor population. It only shows up when the boarding shuttles come. And by then, if you haven't counted for it, if you have spent 60 years looking at these people and thinking manageable, it is very, very much too late.